On June 24, 1863, the Second Vermont Brigade was ordered to withdraw from picket duty along the Occoquan River. The next morning, they would use this road to move to Union Mills, where they would meet up with Army First Corps. However, shortly after the Federal retreat, Confederate General Jeb Stuart would cross his cavalry at Wolf Run Shoals and use this same road on his way to join Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Ironically, both armies would be on their way to a little town in Pennsylvania.
By mid-June 1863, Union commanders realized that General Lee intended to invade the North. Lee hoped to defeat the enemy by drawing them away from Washington and into Pennsylvania, and by doing so, demoralizing the North. His ultimate goal was to gain recognition of the Confederate government and end the war. On June 25th, approximately 3,500 soldiers of the Second Vermont Brigade began a forced march, falling in behind the Army of the Potomac.
Quite a number, believed we, were to march directly to Alexandria and Washington and be placed on reserve duty and remain in the defenses of Washington until our term of service expired, and then sent forward to Vermont to be mustered out. And for this reason, some were in the ranks that morning, which if they had known where we were going and what was before them, would have been sick, lame, or had some other excuse.
After 2 days of hard marching, the 2nd Vermont crossed the Potomac River on a pontoon bridge at Edwards Ferry, finally leaving enemy territory and entering into Maryland. On the Maryland side of the Potomac, the men of the 2nd Brigade passed a general store, the ruins of which are still visible today. That night, the exhausted men camped near Poolesville, Maryland, having marched nearly 60 miles in 3 days.
I'd been sick in camp with the mumps and was in bad shape when I started. My old army shoes got filled with mud and gravel, and my feet were sore and blistered long before we reached Edwards Ferry, where we crossed the pontoon bridge into Maryland. The captain let his boys ride on his horse and went afoot. And in this way, quite a number of us reached Gettysburg that otherwise would have been left behind. Calvin Richardson, 13th Vermont.
Many of the men who dropped out were reported as being footsore. Because the brigade's term of service was nearly over, they had not been issued new shoes.
Captain Lonergan's horse got bemired in the Monocacy, and the captain, in dismounting, got completely covered with mud. Of course, he was the laughingstock of the whole brigade as he lay floundering and attempting to get out. Lieutenant Colonel Roswell Farnham, 13th Vermont.
Captain Lonergan, with vivid descriptions of his tumble into the muddy waters of the Monocacy. He remarked at the time,
"Too much liquid on the outside and not enough on the inside, or it would not have happened."
The brigade reached northern Maryland exhausted and hungry. Rations were nearly gone, and a supply wagon was not near.
On this march, likely none would have objected to hardtack sandwiches with worms, dead or alive. Food and water on such a march are indispensable. Many of us had greenbacks and could buy. The price was high, but the food was the very best. I paid $1 a loaf for bread and 50 cents apiece for cherry pies. Some of the boys would say, "No use to save our money, may be killed tomorrow."
Some soldiers believed that they would be killed in battle. One such soldier was 21-year-old James H. Wilson of Warren, Vermont. While on the march to Gettysburg, Wilson said, "Our time will soon be up, and we shall go home. I shall never go home alive. We shall fight, and I shall be killed." The brigade spent the night at Adamsville, and the next morning arrived at Frederick, Maryland. After marching in the rain all day, they reached camp at Cragerstown. George Benedict of the 12th Vermont Regiment had been promoted to lieutenant and served as aide to General Stannard. The brigade began their march on June 25th without Benedict. General Stannard chose instead to send him to Washington, D.C. on special assignment. On June 29th, while searching for the brigade in Frederick, Maryland, Benedict came upon General Joseph Hooker.
As he returned my salute, I noticed the expression upon his striking features and said to myself, something's going wrong with Hooker. He is not happy.
General Joseph Hooker had been relieved by President Lincoln as commander of the Army of the Potomac and was replaced by General George Meade. Meade was just the latest in a series of generals appointed by Abraham Lincoln who had been pushing for action and results.
After a forced march of 6 days from Union Mills, Virginia, we find ourselves at this place, which is 1 mile from the Pennsylvania line. The first 3 days' march, the men stood it well. We have averaged to start at 4 o'clock in the morning and march until 6:30 p.m. The last 3 days, they have marched the men as long as they thought they could move. They have fell out by hundreds for the last 3 days from the brigade. It has rained every day since we started. Some of the time, the mud has been 12 inches deep. Lieutenant Siren B. Lawton.
Due to the urgency of their mission, Stannard issued an order that no soldier was to leave the ranks to procure water.
Sometimes we marched for hours, after the last drop of water had been drawn from the canteens. Many of the men became fevered, and the suffering of others were so intense that they fell out, crawled to some muddy pool to lave their cracking limbs. Lieutenant Albert Clark.
The situation was so desperate that General Stannard placed a guard at a well to prevent men from breaking ranks. Not even those in direst need were allowed water. Finally, Lieutenant Stephen F. Brown of the 13th Regiment, disobeying Stannard's orders, loaded himself with canteens and took the matter into his own hands.
As they marched, men fainted and fell, some with ghastly, upturned faces as if dead. Others struggled convulsively in the dust. We were ordered to leave them in the road where they fell. I took the canteens of our exhausted comrades towards the well, beside which was a mounted cavalryman with a drawn saber, who upon our approach announced that he was a safeguard and that we could get no water there. I told him that I intended to get water by whatever means necessary, and gave the man my name, rank, company, and regiment. Lieutenant Stephen Brown.
Brown filled the canteens and returned with the precious water. Stannard, furious over what Brown had done, placed him under arrest and took his sword. Lieutenant Siren B. Lawton wrote on the morning of July 1st to his former employer in Wilmington, Vermont.
Headquarters Company F, 16th Vermont Volunteers. Camp in the field near Emmitsburg, Maryland, July 1st, 1863. Mr. E. and O. Gesham. Gents, it is now 8 o'clock a.m., and we have orders to move again at once. My feet are worn out. Can't do much fighting when they get to the enemy. Tell the folks that all the boys are well except being footsore. We go into Pennsylvania. This is splendid country. It rains again. Have had no mail for 8 days. I am sincerely your obedient servant, Lieutenant C. B. Lawton, Company F, 16th Vermont Volunteers.
The letter, however, would never be sent. About noon on July 1st, the brigade was near Emmitsburg, Maryland, about 12 miles from Gettysburg. A courier rapidly approached and advised General Stannard the Union forces had engaged the rebel army at Gettysburg and that General Reynolds, the corps commander, had been killed. Stannard was ordered to Gettysburg as quickly as possible because it was feared the Union forces may be overrun. The 13th, 14th, and 16th Vermont regiments received orders to proceed to Gettysburg. The 12th and 15th Vermont regiments stayed back to guard the ammunition and supply trains, and in doing so did not participate in the battle.
As the sound of cannon rolled down the valley and broke on our waiting ears, the brigade involuntarily halted and eagerly listened to the magic sound that was calling us to hasten on.
The brigade approached Gettysburg along the Emmitsburg Road, southwest of the Round Tops. Leaving the road, they crossed a field along Plum Run Valley, past the peach orchards, past Cemetery Ridge, as far as Cemetery Hill. The brigade waited while Lieutenant Benedict went ahead to inform the division commander the 2nd Brigade had arrived.
These were trying and anxious moments waiting for Stannard's aid to return. The passing wounded, bleeding and moaning, was a sight that spoke volumes concerning the results of the pending battle that we were now being led into.
The sun bore down as Lieutenant Benedict returned with orders to join the 1st Corps at Cemetery Hill, just south of Gettysburg. When they reached Cemetery Ridge and Hill, it was occupied by the decimated ranks of the 1st Corps. The units fought hard and desperately tried to hold their ground, but oncoming Confederates forced Union soldiers back from position to position. Both armies suffered great loss, but the Union forces had succeeded in slowing down the Confederate advance. By the end of the first day's battle, the two corps were spread in a line from Culp's Hill to Cemetery Ridge. The night of July 1st, the physically exhausted men slept on their arms. They were so close to the front line that lighting a fire or even a match would draw enemy fire. The soldiers ate cold supper in silence and in the dark. It would be their last full ration for the next 3 days. In 7 days, the 2nd Vermont Brigade had endured a 130-mile march in heat, rain, and mud. Hundreds fell out from fatigue and illness. With just days or weeks left in their 9-month enlistments, these men finally were about to experience the realities and horrors of war.